We are live. Hello, everybody, boys and girls, those who bounce in between. It's your friend, Comrade Dankey Kang here, and I am very pleased to be joined today by our good friend and comrade, a fellow socialist YouTuber by the name of thechadicalkamikaze. How are you doing, comrade?
I'm doing terrific. Dankey, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here too. So my first question for you is, where did the username come from? Because it's very interesting.
Yeah, sure. I'm a big wrestling fan, and one of my favorite wrestlers of all time, but he went by the name the Kamikaze Kid. At the time, he was also called the 123 Kid, and he was also called X-Pac. His name is Sean Waltman, and yeah, I felt very inspired by that name.
Awesome. That's pretty cool. I mean, not all of us can say that our namesake is based on like a cool, badass wrestler. Mine's based on a video game character. like like most neck bearded basement dwellers, I took inspiration from video games. And the Chad, that is the Chadical Kamikaze, took inspiration from wrestling.
I did.
A much more Chadly thing than video games for sure.
For
Let's,
sure, for sure.
let's see. Who do we have in the comments right now? We have Xeos. I think I'm saying that right. He says hello, hello. We have Jesse Bug. What is up, Jesse Bug? I love you so much. We have Jawad Syed. He says, sup. Welcome to yet another stream, comrade. First and last says, hey, hey. I say, hey, 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 in response. Comrade Jib says, hey, comrades.
Hello.
Aru-chan says, hello. First and last says, greetings. Or no, this is not first and last. Philemon Isunga with a badass. Dude, look at that icon. That is a badass icon right there.
Absolutely.
Greetings, comrades. Arctic Angel, once again, one of my frequent viewers. Hello, Arctic Angel. It's good to see you again. Mr. JH, and the Kung Fu Robber with cancel cis white males. And I agree. I don't like it when I get white mail in the mailbox. I want my envelopes to be manila envelopes. So, the state of YouTube in 2020.
Yes.
So how long ago, comrade, did you start your channel?
I've had my channel for about let's see here. I never really posted on it, but I've had it since about 2013.
Oh, cool. So, like, when did you start really posting?
I would say about a month ago.
Oh, nice. So, so you've been lurking for a while. That was sort of like how I was at first. I was
Yes.
a lurker for about 4 years. And then it got to the point where I just couldn't take it anymore. And I decided, if all these chuds and all of their bad dipshit opinions can get thousands and thousands of subscribers, well, maybe I can get, a couple thousand with some Marxist theory.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how about you, comrade? What finally persuaded you to break your silence?
Yeah, so actually, for about 3 years, I've run a I would say, very quite successful Instagram page. It's now about to hit 1,700.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, and wow, it's just been tremendous. I started in about mid 2017. Of course, when the Trump effect really started to take place, and of course, everybody was getting involved in politics at that time. And so I started off, as a centrist Democrat, I guess.
Right.
And then I worked my way up. I went through numerous left-wing ideologies until I finally came to the conclusion, after reading some theory and listening to some very, very like-minded intellectuals. Well, I would classify them as intellectuals. And I concluded that I am a Marxist-Leninist.
That's awesome. And I feel like that's an important point to make. Very few people are actually born, Marxist-Leninist. Very few of us indeed are born with a copy of Das Kapital, like right in our hand, right as we come out of the womb. we have a full-blown Marx beard and we're ready to start the revolution. For a lot of us, especially a lot of us here, in the West, in the United States, socialism has become sort of a dirty word, sort of a taboo political affiliation to have. And so to sort of get past that hurdle and actually take the time to sit down and research socialism and Marxism and Leninism, it's commendable. So I'm glad that you're here. I'm glad that you did the research, and I'm glad that now we're two tankies on a stream sitting and talking about Marxism, Leninism.
Absolutely.
Got a comment from Jesse Bug. I love you too, Dankey. Thank you very much, Jesse Bug. So, what I assume we're going to be talking about today is just like leftism in general, socialism, maybe socialism on YouTube and that kind of thing.
Yes, I wanted to dabble in many of those topics. Let me get into my first question.
Sure.
So here's my question to you, and I've got I think about 11 questions for you, and this should take about the majority of the stream.
All right.
And I hope you're ready.
Sure.
So what is our response to mainstream media such as the Epoch Times, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, doing hit pieces and smear merchancy on the Chinese Communist Party? And are these actions spreading xenophobia across the United States?
Oh yeah, they absolutely are. Here in Tennessee, so we're seeing sort of an extreme xenophobia against Chinese. We're seeing a rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, especially from the right, but also from the left too. To certain elements of the left will criticize China and the Chinese Communist Party, but the reaction from the right has been extremely vitriolic. Here in Tennessee, our Senator Marsha Blackburn has seen fit to try to, cancel the Confucius Institute here at the University of Memphis. The Confucius Institute is essentially a performing arts organization. They were paid by the Chinese government to go to campuses abroad and to put on Chinese cultural exhibits like Chinese acrobatics, puppet theater, but not just Chinese stuff. They also do Japanese things as well as Korean works of art and performances. And at my old college, they actually performed a Japanese kabuki performance. So that was very interesting to see. Now, the Confucius Institute, it's absolutely not politically motivated at all. These people, the kabuki theater, they weren't trying to get everyone to convert to Marxism, Leninism. They weren't trying to get everyone to register to become Communist Party members, nothing like that. But if you listen to what our Senator Marsha Blackburn has to say about the Confucius Institute, they are essentially, according to her, a front for the evil Chinese Communist Party to indoctrinate people with communism over here. And so she is calling for the University of Memphis to ban the Confucius Institute. It essentially amounts to a racist and xenophobic attack against Chinese students and against performers who essentially want nothing else than to share part of their cultural heritage with us. You would think, being part of a university, that we would welcome diversity, we would welcome other cultures, but we're seeing now this attack against diversity, this attack against Chinese people and Chinese culture coming from the right. And so, yeah, you are absolutely seeing a rise in anti-Chinese sentiment. China is quickly becoming everyone's scapegoat. It's the scapegoat for the coronavirus. It's the scapegoat for pretty much anything and everything that we can blame them for. Right now, we are seeing from the left a criticism of China over issues like the Hong Kong riots and the response to what is happening in the Xinjiang province with the Uyghur population. The funny thing about both of those things is that it is completely supported by the Western media, this narrative that China is committing genocide against the Uyghur people, which has not been proven, hasn't been substantiated in any way. And there's also this notion that we need to support the Hong Kong protests. And I see both of these elements from the left being used to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I was on a stream with Comrade Paul Morin a few days ago, and we had a question asked to us about China. And generally, I think the policy that Marxist-Leninists should have towards China is one of critical support. After all, this is a country that is still, being led by a communist party. They have a Politburo. They have 5-year plans. And one thing that we have to understand is that China is not trying to directly antagonize the United States. You read what Xi Jinping writes in his book, The Governance of China, and he wants to have a peaceful coexistence with other countries. China, at this point, isn't really looking to extrapolate revolution or export revolution elsewhere, and they're not trying to directly challenge the United States militaristically. They want a peaceful coexistence. And so one thing they're doing is utilizing their own national bourgeois to boost their industry, to boost their productive forces, so that one day very soon, poverty can be eliminated from China, and they can actually begin the steps to building a socialist economy. And one of those steps is, of course, the eradication of poverty. So one of the questions that I get from other leftists is, do you think that China is socialist? And right now, not even the Chinese Communist Party says that they're socialist. China is not a socialist country yet, but it is a country on the way to socialism. It's being led by the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, they were set to eliminate poverty by this year, but unfortunately, the coronavirus hit. So, in short, while the Chinese Communist Party, while their policies, we may have disagreements, I think the best approach to have towards China is one of critical support. We can criticize them constructively, not using imperialist propaganda, not using reactionary or xenophobic propaganda, but we can criticize them from a Marxist-Leninist viewpoint while still supporting their efforts, while still supporting their government and their society and the Chinese people as a whole. So I hope that sort of answers your question about China. We're seeing a rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, and I think the proper thing that Marxist-Leninists should do is have a critical support of China, especially at this point.
I would absolutely agree with that, and I'd even add on to that as far as criticisms from the left. Uh, Constantly, I hear certain bread tubers such as Vosh and Xanderhall calling out China for their intellectual property violations, so to speak. And
Right.
of course, the quote unquote Chinese imperialism and talks that, yeah, and talks that, somehow liberating uh, Tibetan people and Uyghur people from, radical religious extremism in many cases, and that this is considered imperialism and the long lasting effects the Chinese Communist Party has actually had in uplifting many people in those regions. And so I think, um, we as the left really must start at this point defining what imperialism is,
Right.
and that it's vital that we spread, uh, like uh, Xi Jinping has talked about doing, that we should spread international coexistence and friendship and solidarity with our brothers and comrades and sisters abroad.
Right. And when you look at what these, quote unquote evil socialist countries are doing nowadays, countries like Cuba, well, they're sending doctors all over the world, to try to help. It's part of their civic duty towards the people. Um, and when you look at countries like Vietnam, this is a country that we pretty much bombed back to the Stone Age, and yet they're sending doctors over here to try to help us. They're sending doctors everywhere else too. So you are seeing with the socialist countries, especially during this global pandemic, a sort of international solidarity that you would never get from the West, that you would never get from a capitalist country.
I agree, and one of the many things that Finbold talked about, this is a great video. I forget exactly what it's called, but I can easily find it. In this video, he describes how some ultra leftists have openly propped up American imperialism against Iran, and said because Iran is a theocracy and because it is quite brutal in many cases and extremist, that it is in our interest to side with the United States in uh, our imperialist efforts to thwart uh, the Iranian regime. And so I would argue that, like Finball did, that a capitalist country that is not imperialist is far more progressive and far more on the track to being ideologically intact with us, is, of course, more in our interest and more desirable and far more progressive than one that is a capitalist country that is imperialist.
Right. And that's the key, that's the defining thing that I find with countries like Iran, is that there are a lot of American leftists that will sit, in the midst of their imperial core country and sort of finger wag at these nations that are not part of the imperial core, but are rather on the receiving end of imperialism. And I feel like it's very hypocritical for an imperial core socialist to criticize these socialists who are, or to criticize other countries that are the victims of imperialism because they're, quote, not doing everything, according to how I would do it. It's basically, I find that to be a very obnoxious sort of opinion, but you see that expressed by Western leftists quite often.
Very
And
much so.
it's the same attitude towards China. It's the same attitude towards Vietnam and North Korea, and basically any other actually existing like socialist country is like, oh, they're not doing everything right. They're not dotting all of their I's and crossing all of their T's, and so I'm going to write them off. And that's a ultra tendency that we find a lot, especially in the West. So someone here asked me, what do I think of accelerationism? And accelerationism is another key trait of ultras. They they want to they want to amplify the already existing class antagonisms by making things worse for the working class. And the theory is that if they make things so bad, eventually all the workers will rise up against the government. This is, of course, ignoring the nature of state power. And if the bourgeois are allowed to crack down even more on the working class, if the bourgeois state power is allowed to fester and to expand with no resistance, well, then that makes it even harder for a potential socialist revolution or for a vanguard party to come into existence. You definitely do not want the bourgeois state to expand its power. And so accelerating that, even though it might lead to more persecution and more pissed off working class people, it's certainly not going to empower the working class. So, in terms of accelerationism, I think it's a pretty short-sighted tactic, and I think that they didn't really think through what the implication of actually exacerbating the class antagonisms would entail. Because right now we're living in the midst of a very intensified period of class warfare in the United States. We're sitting at an estimated 30% unemployment. We are having Black Lives Matter, George Floyd protest in every major city. In addition to suffering through a global pandemic that's claimed over 100,000 American lives. And so how much more do these ultras want us to accelerate things? Like, how much worse do they want things to get? If the American people are not unanimously rising up, begging for the overthrow of the government now, then what kind of constraints would an accelerationist apply to the United States to force that to happen? Would we have to start a war? Would we all have to, would we all have to start dying of coronavirus? Just the fact that there are people out there who say the best strategy is to make things worse for the working class so that things can get better later reminds me kind of like the Social Democratic Party in Germany, who, when the Nazis took power, they had this attitude that after the Nazis, it's our turn. People will get so tired of Hitler, they'll get so tired of fascism that they will turn to social democracy to save them. And that didn't happen. And German Socialist Party had that opinion too. It wasn't just the Social Democrats. So, with all of that in mind, hoping that you'll have a revolution if things get bad enough isn't the way to go about it. It would be so much more constructive to participate in an organization or to build a vanguard party or to recruit for a vanguard party than it would be to try to exacerbate the class antagonisms and make things worse. At least, that's my point of view. What do you think about that, comrade?
Yeah, so here's the thing with these ultras. A lot of times they will take the age-old Marx quote out of context of Marx saying that he votes in favor of free trade because it busts up international borders, which is inherently a right-wing concept, at least in actual theory, and it busts up a lot of those borders as well as increased class antagonisms.
Right.
So I think that quote is taken out of context and used by ultras a lot of times, and I think that's Go ahead.
And of course, Marx lived in a time where he didn't really predict how imperialism would come about. Finance capital trying to extrapolate their earnings to other poor third world countries, in the global South. Marx could not have anticipated something like that or something like World War I. And so, as smart and as intelligent as Marx was, even though he was a great visionary, he didn't have a crystal ball, and he wasn't able to anticipate how imperialism would develop after his death.
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree.
let's see. A commenter named First Last says, "Hey Dankey, do you have any files or street march to defend the DPRK? I'm curious, since you consider Kim Jong Un a comrade, as do I." Well, you'd be pleased to know that today, I was not part of this recording, but the Iron Curtain podcast recorded an interview with Comrade Natalie, who she is an excellent comrade, very knowledgeable about the DPRK. So we'll have a podcast ready for you, comrade, if you wanted to tune into that. It'll probably be uploaded in a few days.
Splendid. I'll be sure to watch.
Awesome. So, yeah, let's go ahead and move on to question 2.
Sure. So Donald Trump, as you know, has withdrawn from the World Health Organization in a time where less than 1 month ago, it was 2 million deaths, not deaths, but rather cases of the coronavirus. Now we have learned it is 3 million. Trump has constantly take-baited the Director General of the World Health Organization, the good comrade from Ethiopia, Mr. Tedros Adhanom of Tigray's Revolutionary Front. Is it appropriate at this time for the president to be tanky-baiting and making these remarks?
It definitely is not the time. There's it's kind of like that Professor Oak quote from Pokemon. There's a time and a place for everything, but not now. And that's basically the trend that I see, is that right now the World Health Organization has a holistic view of what is happening with this virus. They probably have a better grasp of the dynamics at play with this global pandemic than any other kind of organization. And yet you see Trump defunding it, pulling the United States out of the World Health Organization. You see Trump essentially demanding that states open up, demand that schools open up, and you see this absolutely sociopathic lack of regard for people's lives or people's safety. And this is a very important point to make, because it clearly shows, this should show everyone here, that the bourgeois does not care about you. The bourgeois does not care about the working class. They will let us die in the tens of thousands rather than their precious markets crash. That is their priority. Trump's priority is keeping the economy going, keeping capitalism going, the exploitation of the working class going. He doesn't want the machinery to stop. He doesn't care how many lives have to be sacrificed in order to appease the god of capitalism. And so Donald Trump, it's beyond criminally negligent what he's doing. It's straight up sociopathic. Defunding the World Health Organization not only hurts Americans, but it hurts the entire world, especially the third world, who often, they don't have the infrastructure like we do. They don't have a CDC in many third world global south countries. And so they need the World Health Organization, and they need funding. And the World Health Organization needs funding to help these countries. So without that funding, it's less likely that poorer countries are able to get the relief that they need. Another point that I wanted to make about this is that the United States is weaponizing the coronavirus. This is not a conspiracy. I'm not going to put my tinfoil hat on. And don't misquote me. I'm not saying that the United States created the coronavirus, but the United States, through sanctions and economic embargoes and imperialism, are weaponizing this virus against countries like Venezuela and against Cuba and against China as well. And if the United States had their way, they would sanction all of these countries, deny them respirators, deny them medical personnel, and ultimately deny them a vaccine when one is developed, in the hopes of toppling these regimes. And specifically, I'm worried about Venezuela, because you see this happening there. That's probably a better example than most countries. So, yeah, you see this weaponization of the virus towards other countries. You see this extremely sociopathic denialism of the virus and this unwillingness to do anything to tackle it.
Yes. So pretty much, the World Health Organization has worked with several different countries and several different people who the United States has not remotely considered going to talk to about certain health issues other than the coronavirus. You know, the World Health Organization was willing to work with Vladimir Putin to bring down alcohol death rates and to work with Jimmy Carter to fix several diseases such as malaria in Africa.
Right.
So my main issue with this is I really do believe that, you know, who better to think about like the health of humanity than a good comrade like Mr. Adhanom. You know, I think that's very disrespectful of Donald Trump to use political disagreements in a time like this as a way to maneuver his 2020 election chances.
Right. He's I mean, it kind of shows how scared Donald Trump is, because at this point, the country is literally like burning to the ground around him. Is a disaster. Only the most committed of chuds would say that Trump has done a good job. For the vast majority of people, Trump's done a horrible job. Definitely not tremendous at all. So, to see Trump turn around and defund the World Health Organization, or to continue having these rallies where people don't social distance and don't wear masks, or to threaten schools and universities with defunding if they refuse to open up, it's just blatant sociopathy, blatant bourgeois sociopathy. If this does not show the American people that the capitalists don't care about them, I really don't know what does, because this is the perfect example. This is, in many ways, the call to reopen everything coming from Trump supporters and coming from Trump himself reminds me kind of Marie Antoinette saying, "Oh, let them eat cake," during the French Revolution.
Yes.
It's such an out of touch statement, and it just shows how the bourgeois are living in their little isolated bubble, and they don't have any idea of what the American people really want. And it's very simple. We want safety, we want stability, we want peace, and we want the ability to live our lives comfortably. It's not that hard. Like, it's not like, if Trump gave half of the money that he's given the Wall Street over the years to the American people, in terms of a UBI or infrastructure investments or things like that, we would be much, much better off as a country. But he doesn't care about us. He cares about his rich donors, he cares about Wall Street, and that's all he cares about. He cares about himself.
Of course, and that's who he, lives to sample to and to preserve their existence. It quite literally is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie.
Right.
Well, wonderful, splendid. I really much enjoyed that answer. So let's move on.
So first and last, ask, why do you skip podcasts so often? Well, the Iron Curtain podcast has about 5 members to it. And I am not physically able to be at every single one. Today, I was busy, but I decided, rather than wait up for me, go ahead and interview Comrade Natalie about the DPRK, because it's going to be a good episode. I had some issues with the internet a while back during the Caleb Maupin interview, and that's how come I was not on that episode. So I have my excuses.
Absolutely, I'm sure you do. So let's move on to our next question. We can now look to the Philippines. Comrade Rodrigo Duterte is now under a lot of media scrutiny over his new anti-terror bill. What is your thoughts?
So yeah, Rodrigo Duterte, he comes across to me as being sort of a fascist. I mean, he is very much a strong man. Trump has been to the Philippines many times and met with Duterte and said things along the lines of, "Oh, I like this guy. He's tough. He's real tough on the drug dealers." And Duterte's, I don't know very much about him, to be frank, but I know his policy on drug dealing is you basically shoot them. You shoot first, you ask questions later. And it's this sort of Wild West approach to the war on drugs that Donald Trump was infatuated with. But the Philippines themselves are a country with just vast poverty. I mean, the levels of poverty that we can't fathom here in the United States. Even the most poorest, downtrodden communities here, compared to what your average Filipino is dealing with, is absolutely abysmal. In the Philippines, the poorest members of the population are forced to scrounge through trash from fast food restaurants like McDonald's and Burger King and things like that to find food, bits of chicken, bits of French fries and things like that. They will actually recook this food and eat it. I believe it's called pog pog. But they're essentially eating garbage. This is a society which results in its people eating garbage is not one that is worth commemorating, especially for Donald Trump, who's he's never had to eat garbage in his whole life. So
Yeah.
for him to sit by in Trump Towers and say, "Oh, Rodrigo Duterte, he's doing a great job in the Philippines," he's ignoring the vast majority of people who actually are suffering. And there's a Filipino communist movement now trying to, have a people's revolution over there. So we give our support to the Philippine communists, our Filipino comrades who are struggling against the oppression of capital and against imperialism.
Yeah, so the reason why I refer to Duarte as a comrade is because, well, he used to describe himself as a Marxist-Leninist. Now, I do, at this time, presently, dispute that to a degree. And I do believe that I would concur with that sentiment of yours that he has acted pretty fascistly, I guess, in many ways, dealing with the drugs, dealing with free speech, things that we hold dear. To freedom and liberty as Americans. And so, and this is not meant to be a pro-American, necessarily argument here. But what I am saying is that while we do carry the original sentiment of the Americans, let's not forget that that country has been dominated. Even now that the Philippines is its own country, it used to be our territory.
Right.
And with Trump presiding over it in such a almost demeaning and brutish way, and like looking down on that country, you can almost truly say that have they really left being a territory in a way, or has our imperialist presence there for so long just kind of continued?
Right. I don't have the geopolitical wherewithal to really say one way or another whether or not the Philippines are more of a client state of the United States or whether or not they are truly economically independent for the most part. But I know in American history, of course, there was the Spanish-American War in which the United States invaded the Philippines.
Yes.
And we put many Filipino people into concentration camps and essentially practiced a genocide over there. It was ethnic cleansing, and it was blatant U.S. imperialism. And that's part of our history as Americans. And one thing that we have to understand, and I realized this the other day when I was reading about Lao, is that the United States has had their grubby little imperialist hands on just about every single country in the global South. And so parts of our history are purposefully not taught in our educational system. And one of those parts is the U.S.'s role committing genocide against the Filipino people.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see here. Yeah, we got them talking about China. And
Yeah.
that's a
He-Man
lovely
says
conversation.
Duterte is whack. He says he wants to kill gays and is proud to have murdered a random person on the street. I remember he bragged about that.
Yes.
He it's just like, all right, somebody take this psychopath and put him in an asylum where he belongs. You know, jeez Louise.
So I guess we'll be moving on then.
Yeah, we can move on to the next question.
Sure. Is more content with the things like, say, Joseph Stalin or Fidel Castro did, even to the effect that they almost entirely agree with their actions. Do you believe that it is now fair to refer to these individuals as red fascists, or would you still call them a comrade?
Here, start again. Try repeating the question because you cut out a little bit.
Sure. So, if an individual is more content with the things that, say, Joseph Stalin or Fidel Castro did, even to the effect that they almost entirely agree with them, do you believe it is now fair to call them a red fascist?
No. When Okay, so as a Marxist-Leninist, one thing that's very important to understand about Stalin, and I'll just start with Stalin, is that a huge amount, almost everything that you read about Stalin coming from bourgeois historians or from Western literature or Western media is coded with anti-communist lies, lies that Stalin deliberately orchestrated the famine in Ukraine as a genocide. That's a common lie that has been pushed against Stalin and against communists ever since the 1930s. You've had lies and exaggerations about the Great Purge, about the Moscow trials, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I keep hearing is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which no one in the West really talks about how Neville Chamberlain of the British signed a similar pact with Hitler. So essentially, you will occasionally run into these people, and you can just call them Nazbols, National Bolsheviks, who these are people who have swallowed up the Western propaganda about Stalin as an authoritarian strongman. And because Nazbols are fascists, they see an authoritarian strongman with a big army and tanks and military parades, and they immediately associate that with toughness, with national unity, and they say, oh, it turns out Stalin was actually a really good fascist, and they like Stalin because of that. But anyone who actually takes the time to research what Stalin's political views were will see he's clearly not a fascist. He's clearly a Marxist-Leninist who was fighting for the liberation of the working class. And so when you run into Nazbols, they seem to fetishize the Soviet Union that has been presented to us in the West, this militarized, authoritarian Soviet Union that defeated their enemies. And it's really the strength that attracts these Nazbols, these fascists, towards identifying themselves as like a supporter of Stalin. And so you have like modern day Nazbols, like Alexander Dugin, who they'll praise Stalin, they'll praise the Soviet Union for rallying the Russian people to their side. But all the socialist stuff, they hate that. They despise socialism. They despise international solidarity. They despise multiculturalism. And so with Nazbols, they are essentially people pretending to be communists, but they are in fact fascists. It's a very confusing, oxymoronic sort of ideology, if you can even call it an ideology.
Yeah.
It's essentially
So,
a meme.
oh yeah. So you are referring to, like, not like the actual party of the National Bolshevik Party, but you're referring to like the online individuals who are, quote, socially fascist and economically communist.
Well, I don't really think you can be social fascist and economically communist, because it's like a dictatorship of the proletariat is a society where the working class controls the state power. And so when you talk about like a fascist society, it's still a society in which the bourgeois controls state power. It's just a very nationalistic, uh, homeland oriented bourgeois. It could be a national bourgeois, but it's still the bourgeois controlling things. Whereas like under a socialist economy, for the first time in history, it's the vast majority of people claiming state power. And so you really could not expect there to be a movement which comes about that's socially fascist but economically socialist, because the dictatorship of the proletariat is a dictatorship of diversity, is a dictatorship of all the working class, not just the white working class, or if we want to use the USSR as example, it was not just a dictatorship of the Russian people. It was a dictatorship of the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, the Estonian, the Latvian, the Belarus, the Mongolian people, the Siberian people. We can go on and on. There were so many different ethnic groups in the USSR, and it was not a monolithic fascist society. They did not have a homogenous culture. And so it was the union of Soviet socialist republics. There were multiple different socialist republics, and they were all together a union, different cultures, different backgrounds. But the thing that united them all together was the Communist Party, the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yes, I'd absolutely agree with all of that, and I don't disagree that you truly cannot be socially fascist and economically communist. There's just no way, because communism is not strictly an economic ideology. It's political and social. It involves national liberation and liberation of, an oppressed peoples, and that goes far beyond the economy and how one is able to handle their finances. And so,
Right.
yeah. Oh, yeah. So I see in the chat, our good, amazing friend, post-Nazbol Judaism, seemed to have some contention. So if you'd like to share that.
Yeah, apparently there's a lot that I said that was wrong. Forgive me. I honestly don't think a Nazi has the right to say that there's so much wrong with what I said. If your own little dipshit ideology seems confusing to us, maybe it's because it's an oxymoronic ideology. Nazbol is a meme, everyone. And it's people like this individual that gives all tankies a bad name. They're essentially fascists disguising themselves as tankies. But yeah.
Yeah. So I think that goes.
Hey, Nazbol Judaism, why don't you share with everyone what your opinions on the Jews are, just so we can see, just so you go mask off for everyone here.
Mask off, mask flip, whatever you want to
do. Right.
Yeah. This perfectly goes along. Yeah, go ahead.
He says Nazbol's been around for 100 years equals meme. LMAO what? Well, dude, anarcho-capitalism has been around for 100 years, and it's just as much of a meme today as it always has been. Just because your dipshit ideology's been around for a long time doesn't mean it's any more valid than it has been.
Or monarchism.
Right. I think I'm going to become a feudalist. I'm going to start arguing that we should all become peasants and go back and live in mud huts, plow the fields all day.
Well, what are you going to do? Climb the social ladder?
Yeah, I guess so.
So I think this goes along with that common theme that, bread tubers like Vosh and Sanderhall go with, that these Nazbols are meant to be, the tankies, and that we're also the tankies, and that we're exactly them. We're literally them. And so, yeah, I think it goes along with that.
Right. and their definition of tanky changes because I mean,
Yes.
when Vosh, for example, said that he had a thing against tankies, he was talking specifically about those people who were pretending to really be socialists. They weren't really socialists. They were just obsessed with the aesthetics of the left, and that all they really cared about was the tanks and the military parades and the marches and the Soviet uniforms and stuff like that. Um, if you want to call someone like that a Nazbol, that would be a very fitting statement. But to say that they're a tanky is to say that they're a Marxist Leninist, and Marxist Leninists are not at all like that. We don't fetishize the USSR. We don't look at the USSR uncritically, just the same way that we don't look at China uncritically or the DPRK uncritically. We criticize all of these countries. Self-criticism is at the core of Marxist Leninist theory and party building. It's a core part of it. And so it's not like we say that every single thing that Stalin did was great or every single thing that the USSR did was perfect. We live in a material world. We live in an imperfect world. We live in a world of contradictions. And any system, even a system that is a dictatorship of the proletariat, will have contradictions. And that it doesn't go away under a post-revolutionary society. In fact, I think it was Engels who said that in a post-revolutionary society, the class antagonisms are actually intensified. They're actually exacerbated. And so this notion that, if real socialism came around, there wouldn't be any problems, I think is foolhardy. There's always going to be issues, especially when you look at the USSR. They essentially had no period in time where they could go through a normal development. They were constantly under attack. They were constantly being sanctioned or threatened with nuclear annihilation. So there was no point in which they could loosen the reins a little bit and say, all right, we are going to take a less drastic route or a less brutal route towards socialism. There was a reason why, after the period of the new economic policy, Stalin decided to forego that and go straight into rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization. And that's because he read the tea leaves and he understood that sooner or later, Germany was going to strike against them, or some other imperialist force was going to strike against them. And the NEP was not allowing the country to grow past a certain point. It helped foster industry. It helped foster a technical intelligentsia, but that time was now over. Now that the Russian people had that technical intelligentsia, they no longer had a need for the NEP men, that whole class of new bourgeois that arose from the new economic policy.
Right. And so this is kind of going to go into my next question. How do we respond to Trotskyites and ultra leftists who smear Marxist Leninists as a new revisionist because of commodity production in the USSR or some of Stalin's achievements as Secretary General?
Yeah, that's a very strange argument that I've heard. You must abolish commodity production, because commodity production isn't going to be abolished under socialism. You're still going to have factories producing commodities. The only difference is that in a system absent of markets, commodities will be produced not for their exchange value but for their use value. So you'll see objects like cars be made specifically to be driven around, to be used, not necessarily to operate well for 10 years and then break down and then, you got to go buy another one. You're not seeing commodities being made for the purpose of competition with other commodity producers, because there is no competition. The state has a monopoly over the production of commodities in a socialist system. So you won't see an abolition of commodity production in socialism. You'll see a shift, commodities being produced for their exchange values to commodities being produced for their use values. And it's not going to happen all at once. I'm sure that there will be limited markets, especially following a revolutionary society, because it's difficult to transition immediately to a full-fledged socialist economy. You have countries like Vietnam, which tried to transition, and they quickly realized that they need a certain market sector. Countries like Cuba are opening up and have a small market sector. China, of course, is utilizing their own national bourgeois. And so you see this attempt to use a controlled, limited capitalism, but it's under the heel of the vanguard party. And I think that's the important distinguishment to be made. A lot of people will level this accusation at the USSR that it was state capitalist. And you could argue that the USSR was state capitalist during the period of the new economic policy, but it's unlike any other form of state capitalism that had existed up to that point, because the new economic policy was still under the control of the Communist Party. So even though you have this new class of what they called NEP men arise during that period, they were still under the heel of the Communist Party. It was all under the control of the Communist Party. And so you didn't have the domination of capital that you have in other countries, which you could call state capitalists, such as Hitler's Germany, where, you know, if you watch the video or the movie, rather, Schindler's List, you'll see Oskar Schindler, a private capitalist, is essentially given subsidies by the German government to create weapons of war and ammunition. That was just an example from cinema, but you know, you can open a history book and see how the Third Reich used private capitalists essentially for their war machine and for state power. And that's not at all true with the USSR. You had capitalism during the new economic policy. It was capitalism under the heel of the Communist Party.
So yeah, I believe that's a very important distinction to make. You know, you mentioned Schindler's List. You see, a lot of these big entrepreneurs like Henry Ford and Hugo Boss, they didn't go flooding to Stalin to go get their money. They fled to Adolf Hitler,
right,
and fascism. So I do think it is an important distinction to make. Now we see with the DPRK and Belarus and even some aspects of Russia, even today, you know, some of the lasting effects from the former regime, obviously, it's no longer a Marxist-Leninist state, granted, but you know, a lot of the lasting effects of the workers' protections have not quite yet been removed, which is why they have gained a high rating on workers' rights by the UN Council. And so I think it is an important distinction to make, because with Belarus, DPRK, and some aspects of Russia, there is no generalized commodity production.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly familiar with the current situation in Russia or Belarus or anything like that, so I won't really be able to speak to that very much. But going back to what you were saying about the Trotskyists and the you know, the demonization of Stalin, you know, this is something that they've always done, and this is one reason why Trotskyism is sort of welcomed and tolerated in the West as opposed to Marxism-Leninism, because it's critical of Stalin. And I feel like it's important to know that, you know, Trotsky went on speaking tours all over the West, where he would frequently denounce the USSR as a degenerated workers' state. And he was invited to speak by Mussolini, go on a speaking tour throughout Italy. And so while Mussolini was imprisoning communist partisans, Trotsky was allowed to go around and give his speeches where he talked shit about the USSR and about Stalin and how mean he was.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's very interesting to see the socialism, you know, the quote unquote socialism that the West tolerates is the one that poses no threat to the bourgeois and one that is anti-communist in nature.
Yeah, and so I would like ask to these Trotskyists and ultra leftists and left comms, what have you, all of our amazing and very enlightened critics. I would ask to them, look at the alternative to Stalin. We see the neoliberal policies of Nikita Khrushchev and the de-Stalinization that happened in the USSR, which led us to this point. And so, just look at the alternative. Like when all you do is you sit in your armchair and you criticize, it almost begs the question, what side are you really on?
Right. And it's especially important to know that Trotsky and Stalin differed on international policy on a very important point. Stalin wanted, at that point, the Soviet Union and Russia in general had been through the First World War. They had been through 2 revolutions and a very bloody civil war. And so by the end of all that, the people of the Soviet Union were tired. And Stalin understood that the people were tired. They wanted stability. They wanted peace. They wanted peace, land, and bread. And Trotsky's solution was, no, we can't have peace right now. We need to export the revolution. We need to keep war communism going, which will essentially turn Russia into a giant war factory to push the revolution westward. And, it was a very unpopular sentiment at that time because no one wanted to go back to war. Everyone was tired of fighting. And Stalin wanted to take the time to build socialism in the USSR, whereas Trotsky's solution was to keep the USSR poor and backwards and extrapolate the revolution to Western Europe, where he believed that's where the real socialist movement would rise up. Trotsky doubted the ability of the Soviet Union to lead the world in the socialist movement. He thought it had to come from Western Europe. It had to come from these heavy capitalist countries. And I think time has shown that if we had stuck with Trotsky's route, it would have led to the dissolution of the USSR. It would have been destroyed.
I entirely agree with that.
And so let's see. Someone has a comment here. Arnaldo de Leon said Xanderthal called a guy named Fellow Traveler a class reductionist and hates minorities, yet he supports a candidate who is class reductionist and hates minorities. This is BreadTube in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen. Shout out to Fellow Traveler. He has been on a stream with me in the past. He's a good comrade. Absolutely. And shout out to Xanderthal. He is the worst comrade. He's the worst boy. He is that kid that your mom forced you to invite to the birthday party and you really didn't want him to come. He doesn't even bring you a present. That's how bad Xanderthal is at being a comrade.
He's the boy at who works for the grocery store that is asking to come to your house and take some of your birthday cake, and you don't even know him.
Xanderthal is the Robin to Vash's Batman. And, that's just pathetic.
Truly.
I like to think I'm nobody's Robin. And, me and the Chadical Kamikaze, we're nobody's Robin over here.
No.
We're nobody's little lackey.
Yeah, and particularly with Vash, about the whole, supporting the class reductionist that hates minorities. I love how according to him, that I am a Nazbol and that I am a white nationalist. However, I am not a supporter of Joe Biden, and I actually voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. However, this makes me a white supremacist, and this makes me a Nazbol. Whereas he is the woke white boy that is voting for the segregationist, power to the people. And so I'm very entertained by that notion.
Yeah. So I feel like it's good to talk about this term class reductionist because I have, spoken about like identity politics and there is a great speech that Comrade Angela Davis gave about bourgeois feminism. And I'll put the clip to that in the description because it's a very important clip. You can talk about bourgeois identity politics and how it's shallow and surface level and it brings no solutions. But when we as Marxist Leninists talk about identity politics, we talk about it through the lens of a class analysis. And if that makes me a class reductionist, well, then so be it. But you cannot ignore the class nature that comes into play when you're discussing things like racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia, capitalism, and the class antagonisms and the material conditions of our society certainly have a role to play in exacerbating those. And if your analysis of racism doesn't include a class analysis in that, well, then it's bourgeois, it's shallow, and it's utterly pointless. So I would challenge people like Xanderthal, replace your rad lib, bourgeois or petty bourgeois your petty bourgeois analysis of racism, sexism, homophobia with a class-based analysis. And, when you do that, still have the courage to call us class reductionists after that. In terms of us hating minorities, I feel like that's laughable. The Marxist-Leninist movement has been at the forefront of black civil rights, of women's rights, gay rights, etc., especially in this country. The Party of Communist USA, the party that I'm a member of, has commissions for members of oppressed nationalities. It has a commission for women. It has a commission for LGBT people. It has a commission for people of color. And so this whole sort of idea that like tankies or that Marxist-Leninists are class reductionists and they don't care about black people or they don't care about other minorities, that's a petty bourgeois lie. And it's one that you see circulated by rad libs like Xanderthal and like Vosh and other reactionaries.
Yeah, so you said you were part of the Communist Party USA, correct?
Yes.
So let me ask you this question. What does the term Bill of Rights Socialism mean to you?
So I don't really know that much about Bob Avakian and the Bill of Rights Socialism, but one thing that I've heard, a criticism of that term that I've heard, is that the Bill of Rights is a bourgeois document. It was written to cement things like private property as a fundamental human right, where, of course, we as socialists don't believe that private property is a human right. Hold on 2 seconds. I got to let my dog in.
Okay.
All right. So there is a person, Bob Avakian. I don't really know all that much about him, but he has sort of a cult-like following here in the United States, and he coined the term Bill of Rights Socialism. It's essentially socialism with American characteristics. And, I really hesitate to say more about it because I don't really know that much. But I have heard the term Bill of Rights Socialism. And I think it is important to find elements of American history that we can draw from as socialists to highlight sort of to sort of show that the socialist movement isn't antithetical to American society. It's there are many elements of American society which are socialistic in nature. You can look at how like the early settler colonies and how they would often have to collectivize their resources or pull them together. You can look at Native American communities and how they were organized to be set up as essentially primitive communist societies. There are facets of, the American identity, such as freedom and liberty, I feel like are perfectly embodied by the socialist movement and the socialist struggle. After all, if you want real liberty, if you want real freedom, you have to free yourself from bourgeois oppression. And so if anything, the socialists are more keen on freedom and liberty than even your most stringent of conservatives. So on that front, we're essentially more patriotic than any conservative or any liberal could ever be, because we, as Marxist Leninists, we genuinely care about the American people and about American society, about the collective. We we don't care about just the interest of the private capitalists.
Yeah, well, whoa, wait a minute. I've got a question here. All
All
right.
right.
What about Venezuela?
Whoa, man, you got me there. You got me. It's time for me to throw my books in the trash, and I guess I'll become a liberal or something. I didn't think about Venezuela. Damn.
Well, you should think more carefully there, commie.
Yep.
So yeah, you talked about socialism with American characteristics. That goes along perfectly with what I'm about to ask you next.
Okay.
You know, Caleb Maupin, our good friend, he's the one that I most notably know as one of those people that would declare that if socialism came to America, it must have American characteristics. Now, while Maupin has, and I will get into religion here, Maupin has said that while religion is a private matter, that the Christian Bible's commentary on socialist principles and verses he cited, such as James 5:1, Luke 1:51 through 53. Of course, the Bible does go further to even lay claim mirror to Marx's famous from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. In Acts 34 through 35, I think. Yeah. With all of this given, what position does the Marxist Leninist take on religion as far as the more religious people among us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was on a stream the other day with Ewoks Unhinged. They're Star Wars fans and communists. And I also talked about this on my stream with Paul Morin. But I think there's a very important thing that we have to understand as communists is the mass line. We have to be in touch with the masses, not necessarily like in terms of tailism. We shouldn't let the masses lead us, but we should understand our audience. And for example, I live in Tennessee, and if I, as a communist, started coming out in front of everyone and saying, hey, I think religion is dumb and Jesus is a fairy tale, well, then you're going to lose a huge amount of people who you otherwise might have been able to recruit if you had come out saying, hey, I care about the plight of the working class people. I want everyone in this country to have political power and to not be politically disenfranchised, and to point out the simple fact that we live in a society of haves and have-nots, I think is a fairly universal statement that just about any American, left, right, or center, would agree with. But the second you start coming out and saying, I'm against Jesus, you will lose a huge swath of people. And I think the synthesis to point out here is to highlight, like you said, how there are various socialistic elements within early Christianity. Jesus himself said that it was harder for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the assembly of God. And so, it's statements like that, verses like that from the Bible that shows this sort of proto-socialist mentality coming from early Christianity. There was also a verse, I can't remember it right now, but essentially the people in the early church would pool their wealth together and divide it up evenly and share according to their need. And so they were practicing a version of primitive socialism there. And it's elements like that from Christianity that you can latch on to, and you can capture, not necessarily capture, but you can enrapture people's imaginations, and you can recruit them over to your side by showing that you're not directly antagonistic towards all religious beliefs, just those elements of organized religion which try to stall the people's revolution. It doesn't matter to me if you believe in God or the Buddha or in magic unicorns, as long as it's not standing in the way of the revolution, it's really not a problem. Now, in the USSR, you saw this suppression of the Russian Orthodox Church. But the important thing to note here is that the Russian Orthodox Church was directly tied into Tsarist power. You could not divorce the institution of the Russian Orthodox Church from the institution of the monarchy. And so, if you wanted to abolish all elements of Tsarist power, you had to suppress the Russian Orthodox Church. And likewise, it would be the same in the United States in terms of suppression of the religious right. People like Jerry Falwell Jr., people like Pat Robertson, and other influential pastors like Jim Baker. They're all right wingers. They're all hardcore Trump supporters who command a vast amount of political influence in this country. And it's those religious elements that need to be suppressed by the People's Revolution. But on the other side, there are people like the Episcopal Church that is welcoming of the LGBT population, that's welcoming of women's rights and people of color. There is a Unitarian Universalist Church who is welcoming of people of all faiths and ethnicities. Those are elements that you can actually side with as a communist. Here in terms of local activism, we're talking about our Communist Student Union working with local religious groups for food drives and things like that. It's very important to understand that when you are leading a revolutionary organization, you have to pick your battles, and you can't fight the state. You can't fight against the state, the chuds, and the Christians all at once. You have to pick your battles. And there are certainly priorities. In a country that is dealing with imperialism, for example, your first priority isn't even necessarily the socialist revolution. It's to combat imperialism. It's to combat colonialism. And once you've thrown off those shackles, then you can deal with the national bourgeois or the comprador class or whoever is still calling the shots. Jesse Bugg points out a verse from the Bible, and he answered them, "Whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise." You see from early Christian society a sort of proto-socialism or a primitive socialism. And you will certainly be able to speak to people on a more identifiable plane if you came out saying, "Hey, I think that Jesus was a socialist," rather than, "Hey, I think Jesus was a myth," and you put on your fedora and you just start tipping away. People are going to get turned off by that. I don't know if you've had experience with like the skeptic community or anything, Conrad, but they come across as the most smug, like self-assured people you'd ever meet. And I say this as someone who, called themselves a skeptic when, several years back.
Yeah. So I wanted to make a quick note here. I am a Quaker. All right. So, and
Okay.
I've watched your, I actually very much enjoyed your video where you called out the Southern Baptist Convention.
Right.
Those people are extremely corrupt. Bob Jones University is actually not too far from where I live in South Carolina.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And of course, I've got lots of family members that think highly of that church. I don't. I have my own opinions, such as telling rape victims that God will forgive them and, stuff like that. And so I wanted to share a quick story about Bob Jones. So my dad told this story. And some people he knew were very close friends with a woman to which Bob Jones tried to buy land from her. And what he said is, "Ma'am, God came to me in a dream. And he said, you would give me that land for free." And she responded to him and said, Well, Mr. Jones, God came to me in a dream as well. And he said you'd give me $1 million for that land. And so Mr. Jones walked away and started his church in Spartanburg rather than Anderson.
I guess God was wrong when he told him that.
And so the point of that is it's about money. With Jerry Falwell, with Joel Osteen, all these big top of the line, evangelical speakers who have $1 million churches and lots of private jets and high commodity attached to their name. These people should not be the spokesman of Christianity. Some of the most progressive movements, such as the abolition of slavery, civil rights, they were churches were very vital to getting those through. And so lots of northern churches during the Civil War, you spoke briefly about in that video about how the Southern Baptist Convention came to be because of the disagreement with the Northern Baptist Convention on the issue of slavery.
Right.
And so I'm very proud, and I say this as a Southerner, I'm very proud that some Baptists, and I'm no longer a Baptist, for the reasons that I stated before, but, that Northern Baptists were able to stand up and actually understand literature and understand, the progressive nature of what many Christians actually intend for this country. And not all of them are chuds. Not all of them are evil MAGA people. They're not like that. Not all of them. And some of them, I think, can be convinced with proper understanding.
Right. It's important to know that communists have been vilified and demonized for so long and for so many decades in American society. You can't expect these people to be trusting of socialist and communists right from the get-go. You really have to start off on their level and explaining things to them in a way that they would be able to identify with. If you hop up on your soapbox and you say, all right, comrades, let's overthrow the bourgeois and install a dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, if you said that to a bunch of Appalachian snake handlers, they would look at you like you were crazy. You have to go up and know your audience and be able to say, look, Donald Trump is a sinful, sinful man. He does not care about the common people. If you're a Christian, on some level, you believe that God put Donald Trump as president. Well, is Donald Trump a godly president? Is he doing what a good Christian would do, president? Letting tens of thousands of Americans die of coronavirus. Is that the godly thing to do? You have to ask them that. Challenge them with their own morality. Challenge them with their own beliefs. You don't necessarily need a airtight logical axiom to convince these people. You just point out how Donald Trump is a hypocrite. He'll wrap himself in the cross and in the flag, while at the same time shitting all over Christian values such as brotherhood and compassion and forgiveness and tolerance.
Absolutely. And, with Donald Trump being ungodly, as they would say, there has been many accusations. Of course, the man can see his court in his own day, but there has been many rape accusations and accusations that he has groomed his children and appropriated them for sexual assault on his behalf.
Right. And so one question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think about the prosperity gospel?
I'm not too familiar, actually.
So the prosperity gospel, you see this a lot with megachurch pastors and wealthy Southern Baptists, but it's basically a way of reconciling like capitalist affluence with the fact that, as a Christian, you're really not supposed to have that many earthly possessions. It's like when Jesus told Peter, like, sell your possessions and follow me. It's essentially the opposite of that. The prosperity gospel is a way for reactionary preachers to twist the scripture around and say, oh, well, God has blessed me because I'm wealthy. And the implication being, if you're not wealthy, then you're not in God's favor. And the implications of the prosperity gospel are extremely disturbing. You see this perpetuated in movies. A movie which I hope to cover on my channel one day, Kirk Cameron's Saving Christmas. If you feel depressed, don't go watch that movie because it will make you even more depressed. It's a horrible, horrible movie. But Kirk Cameron basically said, yes, Christmas is in fact about giving. It is about giving gifts, and it's about buying, and it's about merchandise. Because if you're a good Christian and God's blessed you, well, then you are blessing everyone else with your wealth by buying them presents and goodies. And this is sort of the reasoning why you'll see megachurch pastors have private jets and giant mansions, is because they'll say, oh, I spread it around. I spread the wealth around. I use this private jet as for my ministry, or we'll take the VBS kids up on a plane ride one day, and it's a whole lot of fun. They'll use that as an excuse. Essentially, I'm wealthy because God has blessed me, and if you have faith, God will bless you too with wealth, and we'll all share in our affluence together. Only that's not at all how it works in real life. The rich get more rich. The mega church pastors collect their donation money, and they count it with glee, and they go out and they buy another private jet, or they buy a Gucci handbag, or they buy a Rolls Royce.
That reminds me of that one pastor. I forget his name. Big time rich evangelical. Uh, he defended his right to have a private jet, and that he said he would not ride a Delta because demons would speak to him there.
Right. I'm blanking on the name right now. Maybe someone in the comments will remind us, but that guy kind of reminded me of Emperor Palpatine a little bit. But see, I was wondering like what your perspective of that is as a Quaker, because of course Quakers are committed to pacifism. They're committed to living a simple life without all of the and maybe I'm confusing this with Amish, but your whole goal is to live a godly life and not to live in a mansion with a Gucci handbag and drive a Rolls Royce.
Yeah, we typically try to live plain and modest, but of course, some people misconstrued that we are like Amish in being Luddites. As you can tell, I'm obviously not a Luddite. I'm speaking to you now on a cell phone. So,
Right.
yeah, and so it's not a matter of that we, want to grow our beards out and we want to, put our buckles on and go churn some butter or something. No, that's not what it's about. It's about living progressively. It's about living, without hate for the most part. Of course, uh, we all sin, of course, and so we tend to break from that every now and then. Of course, we're humans. That's a given. And so we try our best to live humbly and peacefully and to listen to people and to try to remain calm in the most intense of situations and to just generally be, uh, I don't know how else to put it, but plain.
Right. And and you see like these prosperity gospels or these reactionary Christians, and their mentality is almost the exact opposite. They're very much in your face. They very much want everyone to believe and think the same way that they do, and they will force you to by law. And
Yes.
meanwhile, you contrast this with the Quakers, and I remember, well, I mean, I wasn't alive for this, but I remember reading that the peace movement, the anti-war movement in the Vietnam era, Quakers were a huge part of that. They were conscientious objectors. And so that kind of goes back into what we were saying about how you can use certain elements of religion that is not reactionary, that's actually progressive, to your benefit as a socialist, as a Marxist. There's a natural ally between uh, anti-imperialism and the Quakers, who want to oppose war and will participate in civil disobedience to do it. They're conscientious objectors. I mean, it's a natural alliance, and spurning all religion as being, the opiate of the masses, or spurning all religion as being, antithetical to the people's revolution, I think is short-sighted.
Yes. And even Lenin, who referred to religion as a booze, he said that it is best to. I'm going to paraphrase the quote. Pretty much that we. Excuse me, I'm drawing a blank.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah. So pretty much, we should not be alienating people's perspective. What heaven above is like when we want heaven on earth altogether as Marxists.
Right. Of course, we have our friend post-Nazbol Judaism who's bro. Well, guess what? You're cringe, imperial scum.
Was he calling you or me cringe?
I think he was calling Star Wars cringe, but I take that personally. I take that very personally.
Oh, Star Wars. Okay.
Yeah.
Yikes.
Star Wars is not as cringy as National Bolshevism or any other fascist ideology. So, I mean, you calling Star Wars cringe is like, it means nothing to me, friend.
Anti-intellectualism, I guess.
Right. Star Wars is an Antifa movie. You have the Antifa super soldier Luke Skywalker blowing up the Death Star, which is like the ultimate fascist symbol. It's,
Yeah.
if you want to interpret it like that, it's an Antifa movie. And I do agree with him on this. Star Trek is better than Star Wars for the most part. I haven't seen Picard, but it's pretty great.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that as well. I'm more familiar with Star Trek than I am Star Wars.
Yeah, guess I'm a Nazbol after all.
Guess we all are. Post-Nazbol Judaism.
So yeah, I hope that sort of like answered that question.
Yeah, and let's see here. All right. So, economist Richard Wolff, are you familiar with that person?
Oh yeah, the good doctor.
Yes. So he stated that immigration made a divide and rule strategy of capital against all labor to make it easier to pursue. Now, of course, our good friend Leftism Today made a video on immigration citing the highly credited works of George Borjas. Borjas affirms that large-scale immigration, therefore, may not drive down wages in particular cities rather than having a depressing effect on wages nationwide. However, us as leftists abhor the practices done by ICE and Homeland Security, such as putting migrant children in cages, or many times they are abused and even raped in their care. So, in your view, what should be our proper approach to immigration? How should we talk about this to more id-pol-centric leftists?
So if your whole reason for opposing immigration is because it drives wages down or it makes it harder for American workers, that's a problem with capitalism. That's not a problem with immigration. You have to ask yourself, what are the causes for immigration in the first place? Well, one of them is the war on drugs. Another one is imperialism. You can attribute most of the immigration that we get now, especially illegal immigration, from instability in the global south. And that's largely a result of imperialism. So it's basically the chickens coming home to roost. And unfortunately, as is the case with most things in American society, when the chickens come home to roost, it doesn't hurt the bourgeois, it hurts your average American. The bourgeois, if anything, will use cheap immigrant labor off the books because they don't have to worry about safety concerns or paying for their insurance or what have you. And so cheap immigrant labor is a boon to capitalism. If it drives wages down, that's also a boon to capitalism. So what I'm hearing is not necessarily an anti-immigrant complaint, but it's an anti-capitalist complaint. And so I think, we should allow people to come into this country and live and work just like normal people. And to say that, oh, we're not going to allow them because it would drive wages down. I think, is a very short-sighted and sort of a callous response to that, because after all, the conditions which propel people to immigrate to the United States are often imperialist. They're often perpetuated by the United States itself. So, as Heeman correctly points out, immigrants are part of the working class. If you're working for a wage, Toady Fan wants me to distinguish. Not all immigrants are refugees, but um, the logic still stands. The bourgeois will use refugee labor as a cheap, expendable force of labor in the same way that they would use immigrant labor. And so refugees have just as much of a chance of driving down wages as immigrants do. This doesn't mean that we should oppose refugees. This doesn't mean that we should oppose immigrants and letting them into the country. I think as socialists, we should welcome these people into the country. And if anything, they will experience the system clamping down on them so hard, it will force them to look and consider more revolutionary politics. So I think not only are immigrants and should immigrants and refugees be allowed in the country, but they serve as a prime recruiting ground for communists. These are people who have not been inundated with American patriotism, the propaganda that comes along with it, the anti-communist propaganda that comes along with it. And so when you show them clearly how they're being exploited and oppressed, most of the time you don't even have to show them. They understand it. They know it. If you can speak power to that, though, they will rally behind you. They'll see someone actually understands. Someone is actually on their side. And if the communists aren't on their side, I really wonder what we're doing. Now the Party of Communist USA has a commission specifically for immigrants, for people of oppressed nationalities. And so, understand the necessity of recruiting from the politically disenfranchised. And there's no group in the United States right now that's more targeted than the immigrant and the refugee community here.
Yeah, and so I would agree with that. Yeah, immigrants are often scapegoated as being the problem here, whereas the real complaint should be with the capitalists who use them. Quite literally, the definition of an immigrant is somebody who seeks permanent residency in a place, and I think that should be distinguished from just a simple migrant. Now, these immigrants are specifically coming here to work, in which, if as you know, the United States is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So inherently, anybody who comes to work is a wage slave. And unfortunately, there is wage slavery all over this country. So I think, in my view, that, yes, it is reactionary to have a hatred of immigrants. And yes, it is dogmatic to say that we should not take immigration at any time. However, I would argue that, yes, because of those effects with, immigration driving down wages and whatnot, we should very carefully consider it, but not target the immigrant, but rather target the capitalists that use tactile immigration, more ideologically, composed with capitalists. Many immigrants, on Fox News, what do you see? They're talking about the horrors of communism. And this is not at all the story of most immigrants. Most immigrants don't actually hate their former country, but rather they, hate the one they're having to move to because of imperialism.
Right. Most people want to live in the land that they've lived in their entire life. There's very few people who want to uproot their lives and move to a completely different country, especially one where the president's extremely hostile to their presence. And then, so a commenter named Toddy Fan pointed out, okay, let's have open borders then. And I think that's a little bit too far. Kind of like what thechadicalkamikaze said. We have to be realistic about this and understand that we can't just let anyone and everyone come into the country. We have to have certain amounts of vetting. Look at the coronavirus situation. If nothing else, you don't even have to consider this from an economic or from like a geopolitical perspective, but just from a coronavirus perspective. If we allowed everyone to come into the country whenever they wanted, essentially having no travel bans or restrictions of any kind, the coronavirus would be even worse than it already is. So, to a certain extent, you need to have borders, and the same is true for a socialist society, especially true for a socialist society. You need to be able to keep your country safe from people who would come in with nefarious intentions, like counter revolutionaries or imperialists or a comprador class or something like that. Um, so Toddy Fan says, where is the line? I mean, the line is essentially drawn by the bourgeois in the current paradigm. And so the bourgeois want cheap immigrant labor. And so this is one reason among a myriad of reasons why the bourgeois supports imperialism and the destabilization of the global south, because they know it will keep this cheap immigrant labor flooding into the country, and they can use these people almost treating them like expendable resources. And so when we talk about drawing a line, we as the American people are not able to draw that line. Unfortunately, it's the bourgeois that draws the line. And so what we really need to do is draw a line on the bourgeois and say, you should not be allowed to dictate these capitalists should not be allowed to dictate our immigration policy. The policy should be dictated by the people. And the implication of what that means is, of course, a country where the American people take control, or at least have more political power than they do right now. So I think as it stands right now, we're not able to draw a line yet. But of course, I would say, just for shits and giggles, where is our line? I would say, of course, you don't want to let people who are convicted of violent crimes or terrorism into the country. You don't want to let in people who are trafficking hard drugs illegally into the country. But you also have to keep in mind that a lot of these things, the crime, the drugs, the cartels, they're directly empowered by American imperialism. Sometimes they're even supported directly by the CIA. And so, to draw a line and to say we can't allow anyone from this country or that country across the borders, I think it is way too stringent, way too overcallous. But at the same time, saying that we need to let everyone come into the country, I think is equally just as short-sighted. There has to be some kind of vetting.
Yeah, so I've often laughed thinking about what if Lenin predicted the transitionary state in which we would finally achieve socialism, and then at this point where the state is starting to wither away in Russia, mind you, just Russia. Think about this, and the rest of the world becomes capitalist. Are we now going to just allow the destruction of the borders at that point? Like, no, you have to do it all over the world, the same way the capitalists operate global capital, the same way you would need to operate internationalist revolution.
Right. And, as it is right now, if we had a completely open borders, under the current constraints of imperialism and economic sanctions against the global South, we would have such a huge influx of immigrants and refugees. The system's already struggling to handle the American population in terms of supplying them with relief funds and basic income in the time of the coronavirus. Now imagine millions and millions of people who come here that are completely politically disenfranchised. They're not citizens. It would be easy to see how the government would say, oh, we have enough money or we have enough resources to give everyone who is an American citizen a certain amount of dollars or certain universal basic income, but we don't have the funds to care for these immigrants. So We're just going to
Yeah.
leave them to die.
Yeah, and I think we spoke about RedTube earlier and about their misconceptions of us. They would perceive like what you and I are talking about right now as equivalent to when fascists argue for a white ethno state and for welfare chauvinism to white people.
Right. And, I'm not arguing that when the government would do that, when they would give relief funds to American citizens and deny it to immigrants, I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm not saying that that's what should happen. I'm saying that's probably what would happen, especially under the current administration. Just
Yes.
keeping it real. So, if for example the Democrats passed a bill opening up the borders, not only would Trump be absolutely livid, but he would be the first person to say they're not getting a single cent of taxpayer money. And that's just how it is. So when examining the immigration issue, it doesn't make any sense to support immigrants while at the same time opposing marches against imperialism or opposing the peace movement. They're all connected. You have to oppose imperialism. You have to oppose the U.S. war machine. You have to oppose the war on drugs, the conditions that create immigration, as well as supporting immigrant communities.
Yeah, and I think this also goes back to that class reductionist versus id pol thing that you spoke of earlier, where it was you have to look at all issues through a class lens and look at it in context to theory, and that it's not strictly just about how like the liberal feels in our heart. We got to look at this through a class lens. And I think it'd be totally naive to say that completely open borders for the sake of diversity, which of course we love diversity. We're not bigots. We're not Nazis. We're not fascists. So of course we don't hold reactionary beliefs like that. But it'd be naive to not look at it through a class lens and say it's just simply not working for everybody right now.
Right. And so I feel like wanting open borders in the current political dynamic that we have in the United States is a completely unrealistic and unfeasible goal to have. And I feel like a whole lot of far left or anarchistic beliefs, they are unattainable, but they look good on paper. We all want there to be no borders. We all want there to be no oppression, no
Yes.
no discrimination against people of other ethnicities or nationalities. But we live in a flawed world. We live in a world dominated by capitalist oppression. And so, I am completely and totally supporting of refugees and of immigration rights. I despise ICE. I despise Immigration Customs Enforcement and our administration's approach to it. I think that the process of immigration has been made so difficult and so costly that people are forced to illegally immigrate, because the process of trying to get your citizenship and go through the system has been designed to force you to give up. It's that way by design. And so this is when you get those tragic stories about people trying to cross the Arizona desert in the middle of summer and they die of heat stroke. And you get the equally abhorrent stories of immigration enforcement or border control kicking open casks of water left behind by certain activist groups, essentially condemning these people to die of drought, of thirst. It's barbaric. It shows the barbarism of our current capitalist system. And so,
Right.
of course, as communists, we want the entirety of the working class, black, white, men and women, gay and straight, Muslim, Christian, atheist, etc. We want them all to be liberated from capitalist oppression. And that includes immigrants, that includes refugees. So if anyone wants to, try to clip this stream and say that we are arguing against immigrants or we're arguing against refugees, that's clearly not true. think me and the Chadical Kamikaze are definitely on the same page when it comes to that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I hope that sort of answers that question. The immigration issue, this is something that I really could dedicate an entire stream to. It's a big, big question.
Oh, well, I would absolutely love to see that. But, going back to that, helping the fellow man, Fidel Castro, in a time of Hurricane Katrina, he went outside of Bush's wishes, and he still sent boats to Louisiana to help people. And so, even though we were a capitalist country that has numerously tried to invade his country and even just displace him and outright assassinate him, and he still had that humanistic perspective to extend the hand, the socialist hand, to help his fellow man, regardless of the state of the country. And so I think we should be doing the same when we become a Marxist-Leninist state and when that revolution takes place.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point, because at the very beginning of the stream, I showed that video of Fidel Castro giving the speech about Angola, and he said something very pertinent, that the capitalists don't understand why the Cubans are helping the Angolans, because they don't have anything material to gain from it. Not diamonds or petroleum or gold or textiles or any other resource. They're not over there for material gain. They're not over there to plunder that region. It's part of their international obligation towards their fellow human beings. That's the reason why Cuba helped Angola fight against the apartheid government of South Africa. And it's the same reason why Cuba is sending doctors abroad. It's part of their socialist duty. There's a real humanitarian aspect towards the socialist movement that wants to stretch beyond international borders and help your fellow human beings, your fellow working class human beings, regardless of what country they're from. Socialists don't see flags; we see classes, and so that's a very important distinguishment to make. Commenter Tim Allen says, "I'm conservative and I love your content. Keep it up." That it's important. I'm glad to see that a conservative is watching a Marxist-Leninist live stream. But I'm glad that you're watching. I hope that you continue to watch.
Yeah, and I think I neglected to tell you this earlier. Before I really started watching your content, I described myself as a conservative socialist, and you've helped me, manually, not just manually, but, in many other aspects too. Like, you actually inspired me to start making videos on my YouTube, in which, regardless of, how those actually went, they got dislike bombed, they got all kinds of comments in there from people who were fans of Vosh and, racist and whatnot. They dislike bombed and destroyed my videos, obviously, but you still inspired me to do that, and I really thank you.
Oh, well, it's certainly my pleasure. I'm really glad that I've had an impact here on YouTube. I wasn't sure if I was ever going to have any kind of an impact, but I'm glad to see that I inspired you, and that inspires me to keep making more videos. So yeah, I'm glad that you're here.
Well, thank you. No, thank you. You've really inspired me, friend, and that means a lot to me. You pulled me out of a really dark place in my life where I really did think that that I was going to be publicly humiliated all over the internet, and that nobody would dare extend their hand of friendship and solidarity to me. So I thank you very much.
This is because you basically got dogpiled by Vosh and his rabid fan base of knuckle dragging morons, right?
Yes. And I was smeared as a ethno-nationalist, as a Nazi, as a Nazbol, as all, everything you can think of, everything that he would that would ever emanate from his mouth.
Yeah, I mean, this stream has clearly showed that that's not true. So, shocker, people, Vosh is wrong again.
Yeah, and
AJ Max, Marxists aren't utopians. They don't have an exact and elaborate answer for everything. Many socialist countries will have differing policies, and it varies by their conditions. That's an important thing to note too, is that Marxist-Leninism isn't just a blanket universal approach. That it will vary on the conditions from country to country. There was a question I got asked in the comment section a while back. Someone was asking about what is the potential for a socialist revolution in the United States, and this is a good question. But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that every other socialist revolution that's happened, socialist countries that have risen up, they've began not as necessarily as socialist revolutions, but as wars of national liberation. The Vietnamese socialist revolution came secondary to their revolution against French colonialism and then American colonialism. The Chinese revolution came secondary to their resistance against Japanese colonialism. The Russian Revolution the Russian Bolshevik Revolution came secondary to the overall revolution against the Tsar. And so in the United States, we aren't the targets of imperialism, we're the perpetuators of it. And so it will be difficult for me to envision a successful socialist revolution that didn't begin as a war of national liberation. Here in the United States, we're not facing an external existential threat. We're not facing off against imperialism. We're not facing off against colonialism. So the real battle in the United States is to show the working class just how exploited they are and how the ruling class fundamentally doesn't care about them. And honestly, we don't really have to do all that much to show them that. Trump shows them that in spades every single day. Every single time the coronavirus count goes up in this country, it shows that fact. So, in terms of what we should do in the United States as Marxist-Leninist, I think first and foremost, because we're in the imperial core, we need to dedicate every single one of our resources to opposing U.S. imperialism. That means attacking the bourgeois state. That means attacking not just conservatives, not just liberals, but social democrats too, because social democrats will also benefit from imperialism. Social democracy requires imperialism. And so, while at the same time I was somewhat supportive of Bernie Sanders, I criticize him on social democracy. And so, to envision a socialist revolution in the United States, I don't know if it will happen like socialist revolutions have happened in the past. Now, we have seen an example of what happens when a Western country does embrace socialism in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. It was a socialist country. It was a Western country. But even they had their own unique material conditions. They had just gone through a fascist regime, and the country was essentially destroyed. And so, from the ashes rose a new, very, very affluent and profitable society for the vast majority of people. The German Democratic Republic is an example that socialism not only can work in the West, but has worked in the West in the past. And so I don't know what the path to revolution in the United States looks like. I think it will look like something that we haven't seen before. I don't think it will come from a war of national liberation. But at the same time, hopefully, America is not like destroyed and burned to the ground before we have our socialist revolution.
Yeah.
But, the current trajectory, maybe Trump will mess it up so much that that'll actually happen. Who knows? But so essentially, even though this might be pessimistic, even if we never get a socialist revolution in the United States, the socialist within the United States needs to dedicate their efforts to opposing imperialism and imposing capitalism in this country, trying to increase general class consciousness. I feel like that is really what socialists should be focusing on, and
Yes.
recruiting not from white upper middle class college intellectuals, but recruiting from the politically disenfranchised, from the black community, from the LGBT community, from the immigrant and refugee community, the Latino community, etc. These are the voices that need to lead the socialist movement, because these are the voices that have suffered the most under the current system, and they are able to most easily identify and sympathize with socialist theory.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. So I wanted to finish out with one final question, the most important question of all. And here it is. Dankey Kang, do you have a pocket full of sunshine?
I do. I like to think
You
I
do.
do.
That is terrific.
You know, I know we're living in a hellscape right now. We have an orange fascist man-child clown as president, and we're going through national protest because black people keep being murdered by our pig police, and we're going through an economic depression, and we're all dying of coronavirus. But I'd like to think my pocket still has plenty of sunshine left. I'm not I think as socialists it is important to have a certain optimism about the future. You see that with Marx, you see that with Lenin, you see that with all socialist writers. They were very optimistic about the future, and I don't think it's hopeless. I think that socialism will be as relevant as long as capitalist oppression continues. And the words of Marx and Engels and Lenin will continue to haunt capitalists like angry ghosts every single day.
Yeah. So I
So
guess, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
so yeah, this stream's gone on for about 2 hours now. We've talked about a whole lot of different things, but I was just wondering if you had any closing statements, or if you wanted to plug your channel or your Instagram page. Of course, I'll put a link to all of that in the description.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So my channel is called the Chadical Kamikaze, and my Instagram page, which is far more successful, and I post a lot more on there daily. Excuse me. And yeah, I'm almost at 1,700. So get me above that. My user on there is the Chadical Kamikaze Cat, because some troll stole my name, and so I have to use the Chadical Kamikaze Cat. And so yeah, that's about it.
That's awesome. Oh yeah, and then so one thing I wanted to ask you, and this is a pretty important question, but are you part of a communist party or an organization?
I am actually not, but I still, and this might get a laugh out of you, but I am still a member. I'm still a registered member of the Prohibition Party from my days as
Oh,
from a conservative socialist. I still hold that membership.
oh wow, the Prohibition Party. I can't say I've really heard of them, but if you ever want to check out the Party of Communist USA, you can go to their website. You can send them an email and get in contact with your local district organizer, and they'll be more than happy to talk with you and answer your questions. And you seem like you would be a perfect fit for the PCUSA. So I wanted to extend an invitation to you on with that regard.
Yeah, excellent, absolutely.
Yeah. And the same goes for all of our viewers. If you're not part of a communist organization and you want to join a revolutionary vanguard party that has an enormously diverse amount of members, we have new members classes, we have commissions for just about anything you could imagine. Feel free to contact me or to reach out to the Party of Communist USA on their website. I'll give a link in the description, and I look forward to potentially seeing you there.
Yeah, absolutely. As to you, thank you so much for allowing me to have the time to speak. Many people won't even grant me that at this point, and you've just been very charitable to me, and I very much appreciate that. And thank you again so much, comrade.
Oh yeah, it was my pleasure, and I really enjoyed having you on tonight's stream. And of course, let me know when you want to come back, and we'll do another stream.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much for listening. This has been Dankey Kang and the Chatical Kamikaze talking about socialism, talking about religion, talking about immigration, and a whole bunch of other different things. So I hope you enjoyed listening. Be sure to subscribe and follow the Chatical Kamikaze on YouTube and on Instagram. And we will see you in the next one, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.